Book of Ruth, we are in session 3 of 4 sessions. So we're going to explore chapter 3. And the book of Ruth, of course, occurs in the days of when the judges ruled. That was a low time spiritually. It was after the conquest of the land, but before they had a king. And but we see right in the middle of this dark period, we have this ultimate love story. It's very much studied even at the literary level in secular colleges, but it has profound both prophetic and personal implications. And strangely enough, of all the books in the Old Testament, this is the one that most specifically focuses on the church. It focuses on the role of the kinsman redeemer. And we regard it as an essential prerequisite to your study of the book of Revelation. And so it's interesting when you study the genealogies that every 10th man takes you to Noah, Abraham, and Boaz. Kind of interesting, just an observation for what it's worth. I think that's every 10th man. We're going to discover there's a 10-generation implication that we'll discover in the 4th session, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. You may recall in chapter 2 that Ruth, gleaning for her mother-in-law, kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean unto the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest. So there's 2 harvest periods here, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. And so that's the time. The barley harvest is approximately the era when we have the time of the Passover and all of that. The wheat harvest is about 50 days after the barley harvest, and it's also the time of Shavuot, which is it's required reading in the Jewish community to read the book of Ruth at that time. And just to refresh you on the agricultural calendar, the first month in Nisan, that would include the Passover, the unleavened bread, and the Feast of First Fruits, which collectively are alluded to as Passover in many of the passages. And in the second month, we have the dry season begins, and then we have May, June, Sivan. That's when the early figs ripen and the vine tending occurs. And the main day in the third month is, of course, Shavuot, typically on Sivan 6. And again, as I say, that's when Ruth is always read. And then in the 4th month, we have the wheat harvest and the first ripe grapes. And then in the 5th month, we have the grape harvest. And I think it's provocative to realize that they harvested the grapes in the fall. There's no way to get grape juice in the spring unless you have refrigeration. So enough of all of that. The special days at this time would be the 9th of Av. Almost every major event that is negative that happens to Jerusalem occurs on the 9th of Av. So that's a dark day of mourning. And so, and then we get to the 6th month with the dates and the summer figs. And then the 7th month ends the year at Tishri, which is the beginning of the civil year, but the end of the religious year. And that's when we have the early rains, and that's where we have the famous fall feast, the Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And so that's a quick snapshot, and that's why if you're going to study your Bible, you want to have a feeling for that calendar, because it ties everything together. Well, in the first chapter, of course, we remember that was when Ruth was cleaving, and the famine drove the family to Moab, and of course, not only Elimelech, but also the 2 sons after being married die, and that leaves Naomi desolate. And of course, Ruth clings to her. The second chapter, she happens on the field of Boaz. She's introduced to him by the unnamed servant. She finds favor in his field. Boaz is a kinsman of Elimelech, which really sets the whole plot up. And he's potentially eligible to serve as kinsman redeemer. And the reason most people don't understand this book is because they haven't acquainted themselves with the 3 critical laws: the law of gleaning, the law of redemption, and the Levirate marriage. And so we'll be encountering all of those forthcoming here. The laws of ancient Israel. The law of gleaning is critical, of course, to chapter 2. The law of Levirate marriage will be critical for the chapter we're in. And then the law of redemption will climax in chapter 4. And the Levirate marriage is a strange idea. The word levir there is Latin for the husband's brother. And it dealt with a situation where you had a widow with no issue. The husband passed away with no children, in other words. She could go to the next of kin and put a claim on him to take her to wife to raise up children for the family. And such an arrangement was called a Levirate marriage. And in Deuteronomy 25, if brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name not be put out of Israel. And if the man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate unto the elders. Now you realize the gate of the city was sort of like town, the city hall, so to speak. So we go up to the gate unto the elders and say, my husband's brother refuseth to raise up unto his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak unto him, and if he stand to it and say, I like not to take her, then shall his brother's wife come to him in the presence of the elders and loose his shoe from off his foot and spit in his face, and shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel the house of him that hath his shoe loosed. So, in other words, if he turned down the opportunity, he was intended to be shamed. He was, and initially he would give the shoe, and she would spit in his face. As the years go by, it gets a little more casual than that, apparently, because we don't read about the spitting in the face part. But the giving of the shoe is the gesture that he's relinquishing his opportunity. That's basically what we're going to encounter here. The law of Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25. He had to meet 3 conditions to make it work. First, he had to be a near kinsman. Secondly, he had to be able to perform. And thirdly, he had to be willing. It wasn't required. So let's get that perspective in front of us here. And by the way, when you study genealogies in the scripture, it's astonishing to discover how frequently that was involved. That was, for a lot of different reasons. And so, anyway, if he chose not to, he had to give her a shoe, a symbol of shame that he had failed to do the kinsman's part. Now, some more background that you should have before we get into this chapter. I like to include a little background on hymns. You and I are used to seeing rank on a sleeve of an airline pilot or a naval officer, what have you. And militarily, it's often on the collar, but we're used to seeing on the sleeves. They, in their culture, had their rank in the society embroidered on the hems of their garments. And we need to understand that. The crespidon in Greek, or the shul, is the hem, and it refers to the border, the fringe, or the bottom edge of a skirt or a train. That's what the term refers to. In fact, in ancient Mesopotamia, to cut off the hem was to strip one of his personality, his authority, his rank within the community. And a husband could divorce his wife by cutting off the hem of her robe. See, the hem was symbolic of the authority. We're not used to that because that's not our culture, but it's important that you understand that to understand God's comments, which we're going to notice here later. A nobleman could authenticate his name on a clay tablet by pressing his hem into the clay, because the embroidery would represent his family, his authority, what have you, okay? And so, you remember when David in 1 Samuel 24 found himself in a cave that Saul was sleeping at. He realized that, so to prove it, he cut off the hem of Saul's thing so that the next day from the top of the hill, he could prove he had the opportunity to kill him, but didn't. In fact, he later regrets that because he realized that even cutting that as a souvenir was an insult to Saul. But the point is, his removal of Saul's hem is the whole issue there, 1 Samuel 24. The Levitical garments all through the Torah speak of the fringe on that to identify them as Levites, if you will. And now, interestingly enough, God himself, in his covenant with Israel, says of Israel, I will spread my skirt over you. That's a phrase that God uses, meaning he's going to spread his authority, his protection over the nation. But that phrase wouldn't mean anything else without that perception of significance there. And this is God's way of expressing his protection over Israel. And there's another thing that you may miss in the Gospels. You remember the woman with the issue of blood. For 12 years, she was trying to get that. So she felt if she could just get through the crowd and just touch the hem of his garment, her concept was that was his authority, that would take care of it. And of course, she did, and it did. But the real point was the concept that underlies that incident is the idea that Christ's authority was somehow represented in the hem of his coat. Okay, and so that was the goal of the one with the issue of blood. And it's interesting that she had that issue of blood the same age of the daughter that was raised. So the Holy Spirit ties those two together for a number of reasons. And we often wonder if the Gentile, we know that the woman with the issue of blood was a Gentile. So is she a type of the church? That's a suggestion. Joseph's coat was a seamless coat, which was very prized, you may recall. And as was Jesus' coat. They may both had similarities, perhaps. Now, Jesus' coat was seamless, and that is why the soldiers at the foot of the cross did not want to divide it. They rather cast lots for it. They divvied up the other things, but the seamless robe, they threw lots for it because it's too valuable to tear apart and take half or whatever. So the temple veil was torn, symbolizing the end of man as high priest. Jesus' hem was not torn because he is our high priest forever. So that's all embodied in that. So, okay, the book of Ruth, love's resolve was chapter 1, where she cleaved to Naomi. Love's response to that in chapter 2 was Ruth gleaning. And now we are in love's request in chapter 3. And this is going to take us into the famous thrashing floor scene. And the whole reward will wrap itself up in the final session in chapter 4. So chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may go well with thee? She's a good Jewish mother, and when she realized that Ruth had happened onto a major kinsman, there's an opportunity here that she as a Jewish mother would understand. So she's going to coach Ruth as to what to do. Okay, shall I not seek a rest for thee? Manoach, that refers to a state of rest or condition of rest, but in this context, it refers to a condition of rest and security to be attained through marriage, as was already implied back in chapter 1, actually. So we got some plot problems in front of us. Let's try to summarize that. Naomi was faced with 3 issues. She's faced, first of all, how could the name of Elimelech be maintained among the tribes of Israel since both her sons were now dead? So she's got a continuing problem there. What steps should be taken to protect her inheritance, which Elimelech had left in Naomi's trust? And finally, how could she provide rest and security for her faithful daughter-in-law? And you could argue that 2 and 3 are opposed to each other. It's a little tricky. How would you do? But you could do one and not the other. So that's what we're sitting here with as a plot problem. And a plot, of course, is a problem and its solution. So let's take a look here. A marriage between Ruth and Boaz would solve all 3 problems. This also meant that Naomi would renounce her own claim to Boaz as the close relative and give it to Ruth, the younger widow. Okay, so we get to verse 2. As Naomi explains to Ruth, he says, And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the thrashing floor. Now, to go forward, you need to have a feeling for what do they mean by a thrashing floor. It generally was on a saddleback where there was a prevailing wind, especially in the afternoon and evening. And in this little sketch, visualize wind coming from the left. And they would take the grain and thrash it. And if after it had been ground, it would throw the grain, they'd throw up the grain in the air, and the wind would cause the grain to fall a little bit downwind. And the chaff would fall further downwind. If it's done right, what happens is you end up with 2 piles. The one that's nearer is the one that is valuable. That's the grain that you package and sell. That which is further downwind, they'd burn to get rid of vermin and so forth. But if you did it right, by balancing your activity, you end up with 2 piles. Now, what they would do, of course, they would do that in the afternoon and evening. Then they would celebrate in the evening a harvest celebration. They'd party. And what the owners would do is they would sleep with the grain so it wouldn't get stolen. The other stuff would be, really fodder for being burned and so forth. So that was a celebration they typically would do at the end of the day, and that's what we're going to take advantage of as we look at this thing here. So they're typically in saddleback areas where there's a prevailing wind. David purchased the thrashing floor of Araunah or Ornan, which later became the site of the temple. That's about 740 meters above sea level. Ophel, the Jebusite village, was further south, the city of David. But the thrashing floor area where the temple was is not the peak. The peak is a little further north, a place called Golgotha. Okay, there was not only a time for work, but a time of celebration. Typically, the afternoon was spent thrashing the grain, and that night they would enjoy a party. Isaiah 41 deals with some of those kinds of things. Later, the owners and the seniors would sleep on site to prevent the theft of their grain. So here's Naomi coaching Ruth. She says to Ruth, "Wash thyself, therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy raiment up on thee, and get thee down to the floor. But make not thyself known unto the man until he shall have done eating and drinking." Okay? And so and it shall be that when he lieth down, that thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie, and thou shalt go in and uncover his feet and lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do. Now, it's understandable how someone reading this, it sounds like she's going to proposition him sexually. That's what most people presume is going on here. No, it's worse than that. Lay thee down is there. That means the place where his feet are, in other words. She was to lie down at his feet after uncovering him. She was to take the servant's position, in which the servant lies diagonally at his master's feet. The position was a lowly one. It represented Ruth as a petitioner. Then Ruth said unto her, "All that thou sayest unto me, I will do." So Ruth gets it. And she went down to the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. Okay, so far. Now, I find this is interesting. Ruth is following the instructions of Naomi. Naomi has never met Boaz yet. Those are things we're going to talk about after we go down a little bit here. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. Okay. Now he would lay by one heap of his grain, and his servants would be scattered over other areas of his property, guarding the heaps of grain there, thus affording a measure of privacy for both Boaz and Ruth. The heaps of the winnowed grain would be at the edge of the thrashing floor, for the center was reserved for the thrashing itself. Being at the edge of the floor with this pile and separated from the others would provide a further measure of privacy. Okay, verse 8. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid, and he turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Now, turned himself, the word is laphath, which is a causative stem, which means to grasp, twist, turn, grasp with a twisting motion. And it was used this way of Samson in Judges 16. It means to turn over, to feel or grope around. He might have been groping for his mantle that he realized he was uncovered. And he said, "Who art thou?" Now here's the key line here. She answered, "I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman." The naive reader would say, "Oh, it sounds like she's propositioning him sexually." No, quite the contrary. This is far more serious than that in a whole other way. She's asking him to take her to wife as doing the kinsman's part in a levirate marriage. And I'm thy handmaid. She used the word Amma, where thus she presented herself as one who is eligible. That word implies that she's eligible for marriage. We're going to retrace the 4 different steps that she went through in her relationship here, but each one is a different one. Here she is presenting herself as eligible for marriage. And so, spread therefore thy skirt. And again, it's the knopf, the edge, the border, the corner of the garment, the fringe, the bottom edge of the skirt or train, if you will. And that's that refers to the fact that a man spreads this over his wife as well as himself. And that's with his protection is that it's implied there. for thou art a near kinsman. Now this is where our pulse is quickening. Here is Boaz, the hero of the piece. Here is Ruth putting this in front of him. But by invoking the Goel, the kinsman redeemer custom, on her own initiative, she subordinated her own happiness to her family duty of providing Naomi with an heir. That's a subtlety that many people would miss, but we'll keep moving here. Do not misunderstand this passage. Some might presume she's propositioning him, but there's much more going on here. So when Ruth says to Boaz, she is making a claim on him to put her to wife because he has an opportunity under the law of the Levirate marriage. Okay? And by the way, no matter how much he loved Ruth, he had to wait her move. I think that's interesting. The Goel says, for you are a near kinsman, is her announcement. And this shows that Ruth's devotion to Naomi. Naomi only wanted to obtain a husband for Ruth, a concern of an older widow for the younger widow throughout the book. But by invoking the Goel, the kinsman redeemer custom, on her own initiative, she subordinates her own happiness to her family duty of providing Naomi an heir. That's a dimension here many people would miss. So we get to verse 10. Boaz speaking, he said, blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast shown more kindness in the latter end than in the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. See, they're not young men. The younger men were Goelim, but that would have only benefited Ruth and not Naomi. Okay? She considered her own happiness as secondary, it would seem. And now, my daughter, fear not, and I will do to thee all that thou requirest. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. She had quite a reputation by then. I think this speaks volumes. But here comes the bombshell. Boaz speaks, and now it is true that I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit, there is a kinsman nearer than I. Ouch. Howbeit, there's a kinsman nearer than I. Someone who would be closer that would have the first right. Under the Mosaic law, the duty fell on the closest male relative unless he waived his right of priority. And this also may explain why he did not make his own move earlier. So he continues to instruct her. Get this, it's interesting. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman part. But if he will not do the part of the kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of the kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth. Lie down until the morning. And by the way, the word in here is lun, not shakav, which carries sexual connotations, but the lun does not. So in the Hebrew, it's clear there isn't a sexual thing going on here. Quite the this is kept on a higher plane here. Tarry this night and so forth. And because of this verb, all ambiguity is removed concerning the sexual implication between the two, because of the way it would be a different word there in the Hebrew. And so, okay. As the Lord liveth, that Boaz puts himself under the oath. As Yorevave lives, then came his final instructions, lie down until the morning. Now, when they were in the very crucible of temptation, they proved themselves righteous by choosing integrity over passion. The plan is spelled out next, and its beginning shall be in the morning. Boaz promised to resolve the issue the very next day. Okay? It will not be allowed to linger indefinitely any longer, and the whole issue would be settled within a day. And she lay at his feet until the morning. She arose up before one could know another, and he said, let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. Also, he said, bring the veil that thou hast upon thee and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city. What's he doing there? He gave her, after all that, he gave her 6 measures of barley. That's a code. I'll explain in a moment here. 6 measures of barley. That's a Jewish code. Boaz gave it for Naomi, not Ruth, because Ruth wouldn't understand it. Naomi would. Why the 6 measures of barley? And we'll find that out in verse 18. So anyway, verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, well, who art thou, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done to her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley gave he, for he said unto me, go not empty unto thy mother-in-law. See, they were not for Ruth, they were for Naomi. And Naomi understands what it's all about, as she'll explain in verse 18. These 6 measures of barley are a code. Now, verse 17 accomplishes 2 things. The verse provides a transition for Ruth's exit from the story, and from this point on, she plays a passive role, interestingly enough. Also, it puts Boaz and Naomi on center stage, since from this point on, they are the active players. Are you with me so far? Okay. And this is strange because it would be normal for the woman to be making the presentation of the levirate marriage. But he's stepping in to take care of the whole thing. But notice what she says in verse 18. Naomi says, then said she, sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day. The 6 measures of barley was a code. How long did it take God to create the world? 6 days, and then he rested on the 7th. By those 7 measures, that's his way telling Naomi that he's not going to rest until this is resolved. It's cute, I think. Okay. How long did God create the earth? 6 days, obviously. And on the 7th day, he rested. When Boaz gives the 6 measures to Naomi, she understands that he is saying that he won't rest until the matter is resolved. And so be in rest until you finish the thing this day. So chapter 3, the situation by the end of this chapter is that Naomi's prayer of chapter 1 is about to be answered. Ruth will find a manoach, or rest, in marriage. The famine will no longer be a factor, since Boaz's gift assured the woman of plenty to eat, obviously. Ruth no longer identifies herself with her lower status, but with her own name. I am Ruth. And she was no longer simply the Moabitess. Okay? The law of redemption, of course, the land of Israel belongs to God. So Joshua entered the land, it was granted the 12 tribes. We mentioned this before. The land was to stay in that tribe. You could sell the use of your land, which was really more of what we consider a lease. You sold the rights to use the land for a time. And so in the year of Jubilee, after 49 sevens of years, the next year was a Jubilee year, the land would return to the original owners. So when you sold your land, the deed would be subject to those rules for redemption. And the law required a procedure so that if your next of kin would show up, there was a procedure by which he could purchase back the unused years called the redeeming the land. And that's what's going on in Revelation 5, although you may not recognize it there. So Jeremiah was instructed to buy land right before going into captivity, just to demonstrate that to the readers. After the captivity, his descendants, see, Jeremiah knew they'd be in there for 70 years. So he passed away during the captivity. His descendants would come back and claim the land. The title deed would be a scroll, and on the outside it would detail the procedure for redemption. The whole concept becomes important when you encounter the 7-sealed book written within and on the backside and sealed with 7 seals in Revelation chapter 5. Okay, so for the next session, our final session, I want you to review the law of redemption in Leviticus 25. Review the law of the Levirate marriage, because we're going to see that unfold there. And so I want you to study, obviously, Ruth chapter 4. But I'm going to give you a supplemental assignment in anticipation of tomorrow morning. I want you to review the strange episode in Genesis 38. When you study the book of Genesis, you get to chapter 37, you're introduced to Joseph, this incredible career that goes from chapter 37 to the end of the book, chapter 50. A fantastic career of Joseph, sold into slavery and emerging as the prime minister of the world. An incredible story. But right after it starts, you get confronted with Genesis 38, this sordid tale of how Tamar tricks her father-in-law into having illicit sex with her. What on earth is that all about? Why is it in the Bible at all? And why is it there? And it will contain a surprise, I suspect, that is generally not known. In fact, I found it in a journal in the USSR. And I was stunned. I checked it out. It turns out to be true, and it's fantastic. And we'll deal with that tomorrow. And so why is Genesis 38 in the Bible? And there's a surprise hidden inside it. And we'll leave that for tomorrow.